This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers lectures 20 to 22 in Seminar 6. It's the holiday season as I film this, and so what better time than now to talk about disappointment? As for many, it's a time when the encounter with a sense of lack becomes most palpable. We feel that lingering absence in our hearts, a sense of depersonalized alienation as we register the overt gestures of joy in others, the added expectations that we demonstrate those same gestures, and the immense gap between those observations and expectations from our emotional reality, hidden from the rest of the world. In the previous video on Seminar 6, we saw how Hamlet is confronted with that disappointment through the encounter with the ghost of his father and the melancholic strategies deployed to flee from it. As Lacan notes, the ghost exposes Hamlet to the fact of absolute betrayal, that everything good is revocable, that there is no signifier that constitutes a guarantee of the ideals that Hamlet has learned to uphold and identify with. Neurosis can be understood as this very flight from disappointment. The argument I wish to make in this video is that the penultimate section of Seminar 6, entitled The Dialectic of Desire, marks Lacan's attempt to unpack why disappointment is an inherent feature of becoming a subject, and in the following video, we'll see how the major clinical structures of psychosis, perversion, and neurosis represent responses to this disappointment. For anyone who has read this section, my focus on disappointment may be surprising since it's not a word that comes up much here. Instead, Lacan speaks of the problem of desire, the question and non-answer of the other, sacrifice, and the notion of the cut. When speaking of disappointment, then, we're not addressing a failed expectation concerning this or that outcome. Instead, we're contending with what might be considered a structural disappointment, one that recognizes that a failure to satisfy desire is not a situation in our life, but a condition for that life. Lacan writes, "The difficulty we are facing is not a new one. It is one of those about which the entire ethical tradition has speculated." Need I echo here from long, long ago the bitterness of the sages or pseudo-sages regarding the disappointing nature of human desire? The question takes on an explicit form in psychoanalysis. Lacan begins this section by re-articulating the unfolding of desire, starting with demand as addressed to the other as the locus of speech. The other, the one called upon by demand, is manifested as a real subject, positioned as an omnipotent, terrifying figure who serves as the mainspring of the subject's history of interpersonal conflicts. Upon this nascent subject making demands, which begin in the form of cries and screams, this real subjectivized big other transforms them from a demand for satisfaction of need to a demand for love. This transformation of demand gets written as barred demand to signal this first stage of alienation in the relationship with the big other, and marks the moment when disappointment first makes its appearance. Because while needs are, in theory, capable of being satisfied, love is not. For while satisfying a need becomes a sign of the other's love, the demand for love insists as unconditional and insatiable. The child incessantly demands for this or that thing, but the child is never satisfied no matter how responsive a parent may be, because what is being demanded is never the object of the statement, but a tacit, infinite demand for the ceaseless presence of the other and for the recognition of the subject as being the object of the other's desire. This insatiability, entailed in the demand for love, opens a new dimension in the relationship with the other that breaks up the imaginary unity between mother and child and wherein the child first begins to assume the position of a subject and going beyond demand and raising a question concerning the other's desire. The word subject here can be misleading since we might inadvertently substitute the word person or mind or some other term that connotes some kind of essentialized independent being or knowing agent. But for Lacan, the subject referred to here is established in the form of a question that arises in the course of being alienated in the other's speech. And Lacan makes a play of words in this context where S, standing for the subject, is equated with the German S, which is translated as Freud's id, and the S or esse that is translated as being in Latin. And then there is, in French, the form of the question S. So all the phonetic similarities here are being connected by Lacan, which is an attempt to show the conceptual relationship between all these ideas as well. And so the subject is a question that concerns its being, a question that is an expression of some element of the subject that is repressed, and it is a questioning demand for the other's desire. Through this question, the subject seeks to establish itself on the basis of an answer provided by the other, an answer that provides an assurance that can guarantee the subject's sense of identity, which in this case entails a recognition and understanding of desire and one's place within the symbolic order. Lacan writes, psychoanalysis and even our daily experience of psychoanalysis teaches us that the question whether the subject can or cannot rely on some other is what determines what we can find to be most crucial in the patient's unconscious. How might this concretely manifest? It manifests every time we seek validation from authority figures. It happens whenever one searches for certainty that we are who we are. Perhaps most often is experienced as a kind of reflexive questioning we encounter when in a social situation. Do I have something between my teeth? Am I appearing nervous? What should I do with my hands? Am I talking too much, etc.? These particulars are but manifestations of the more basic question, which is this: what does the big other want? And can I trust the big other's words? Let's not forget here that the question emerges from the fact that love remains unsatisfied. So another way of thinking of the question is this: what do I need to be in order to receive the love that I am demanding? What does the other want so that I may know what I must become to receive this love? The tragic dimension of this questioning is that there is no answer, because the other, marked by signifiers as well, is incapable of providing any guarantee of an ultimate answer to the question. This lack of the other is signaled by the barred A. Lacan writes, there is nothing in the other or signifierness that can suffice at this level of signifying articulation. There is nothing in signifierness that can guarantee truth. There is no other guarantee of the truth than the other's good faith, and this good faith always presents itself to the subject in a problematic form. At this point, if we don't flee from the exposure to the lack in the other, we encounter a profound sense of disappointment. Not the disappointment that comes with frustration in our initial relationship with the big other, but the disappointment that comes with privation, a real lack in the other. This forms the basis for the structural nature of holiday disappointment, beginning with the realization, for example, that Santa Claus fundamentally lacks being, which gets extended to the whole holiday season, particularly as it's bound to the logic of capitalism and the structural impossibility of it providing an answer to the question concerning the desire that it institutes in us. We also behold it in the real others in our lives who we observe playing out their expected role of holiday cheer that belies the failure we discern in them to be able to truly live up to the joy they feel compelled to express. This disappointment is not a mourning, but a melancholic position wherein the subject becomes stuck in an overwhelming encounter with jouissance, experiencing this loss as occurring in the real itself rather than as a constitutive lack that connects the subject to the symbolic order. The too muchness of this jouissance has a destabilizing effect that manifests in the painful modes of arousal and morbid excitation that at this time of year is encountered as holiday disappointment. The dialectic of desire then moves from a recognition of the lack in the other to a recognition of oneself as also lacking, signaled by the barred S. And herein we come to terms with the final disappointment, which at this point of the dialectic gets named castration, concerning the inevitable disappointment and dissatisfaction of our desires. The other's lack here is not merely a lack of an answer to a knowledge question, but is a lack of an answer concerning the question of the other's desire. When there is no answer for that, such desire is traumatically overwhelming, filling us with a sense of melancholic hopelessness. To situate ourselves in this lack of the other, then, we have to make a sacrifice as a way of manufacturing an answer to the fundamental question, what does the other want from me? It's an attempt to locate and understand the other's desire by offering up something we value. And we do this because we cannot directly know the other's desire, which remains fundamentally opaque. Of course, such sacrifice does not provide the ultimate answer to the question, but this act of renunciation serves to establish our position within the symbolic order. It's an imposed limit that provides boundaries to know where we stand. It is the acceptance of castration that allows us to enter this holiday season with its rituals and ceremonies in a manner that allows us to situate loss within the context of a meaningful world. And so we give up the possibility of any complete satisfaction of our desire, sacrifice a piece of our jouissance, a piece of our life, of ever having a total answer to the question about the other's desire, so that we may gain a substitute partial satisfaction that comes with assuming a particular social identity and position in the symbolic order. This is what is called the paternal metaphor, a substitution of the mother's desire for the name of the father. As such, rather than a pure unmediated desire, we now arrive at a desire that is conditioned by the law. There remains a final step in this dialectic. A dialectic we shouldn't think of as a chronological unfolding, but as a synchronic and structural situation that is co-occurring all the time. The progression is logical, not necessarily historical, though it always intersects with the subject's history. This final step concerns the emergence of an object that is produced as a remainder of the original relation with the big other, and which the barred subject forms a particular connection to, giving rise to what Lacan calls the fundamental fantasy. In making a sacrifice, in undergoing castration, an object emerges that supports the subject at the point at which it encounters its desire. The object represents the subject's attempt to make up for a deficiency by fashioning an object produced from what remains unaccounted for in the other, that being the other's desire, which the subject questions out of the unfulfilled demand for love that remains after need has been satisfied. So what does this mean? Let's recall that the real history of the subject takes place at the level of demand, wherein there is this initial alienation in having our intentions pass through the locus of signifiers that is the big other. In this process, something always gets lost in translation because I cannot create my own language, but must borrow it from the other who seems to hold all the keys, except that the other is missing a key herself, the key that would be the answer to her own desire. And it is the missing key in the other that leads the subject to sacrifice something that cannot be unlocked, something that goes unarticulated, something that is forbidden from entering overt discourse through the signifiers that have been made available to the subject. How then is the subject supposed to function within a symbolic order that cannot account for something near and dear to the subject? Well, the subject must give it up, remove the door for which there was no key. But in doing so, there remains an absence in its place, this piece of life that the subject has sacrificed. It's only in mourning this loss, which entails an acceptance of disappointment as inevitable but meaningful, whereby a substitute object emerges that can prop up the subject by sustaining its desire in a highly particular manner. So where does this substitute object come from? Lacan states that the subject brings it from the imaginary register, a part of oneself that is involved in the imaginary relationship to the little other, and which serves as an attempt to make up for the deficiency of the signifier in the other. It's a remnant of the traumatic encounter with this other's lack. Now, Lacan adds that the form of the object shows itself through a cut. So before talking about the different forms of object A, it's important to more precisely define this cut. When something is named, let's say a tree, the act of naming the tree introduces a cut between the tree and the rest of the surrounding environment or reality. So cutting is a structural characteristic of language, and it's the root of all symbolization. The tree only is and only has being because of the cut of language. The whole of reality is made up of these cuts, understood as the intersection of language into the real. The cut itself is not language, but the effect of language, and every cut involves loss, not only all the other possible beings that could have emerged from other kinds of cuts, but also, and perhaps more fundamentally, the loss of that mythological pre-cut reality that we can never return to. That's all very interesting, but where this is most relevant to psychoanalysis is not the cuts between objects in the world, but those between subject and object. The cut is a way of talking about this in-between of subject and object. For the child, the first cuts are involved in weaning and toilet training. The nipple and excrement are situated at a cut. And from these examples, we can see here this relationship between the act of symbolic cutting and various essential bodily functions. And it's this cut that forms the basis for what is called in psychoanalysis the pregenital object, which is a residual of these cuts and that finds symbolic instantiations in everyday life through demands that take on a metaphorical function. So, as the classic examples of smoking connected to oral fixations and things like that. But of course, there is the cut that we've already spoken of, castration. It's here where the cut is internal to the subject itself, a subject cut off from itself, barred or split from itself, giving rise to a subject-object relation wherein the object is a piece of the subject itself. This cut introduces an irreparable loss for the subject, but is also what institutes the relationship between the subject and its desire, or the subject as desire. I am born of the cut, as it marks a separation from the other. This desire, then, that is born of the cut, takes on a metonymical quality, being displaced upon any innumerable set of objects that then stand in for that desire that I have been cut off from. And so the cut produces an object that in turn mediates all other subject-object relations. It is the object in the object, or perhaps more accurately, the subject in the object that the subject then relates to. And it's what Lacan says many times in the seminar is what is missed when the miser loses his treasure. This object is difficult to concretely identify because it's not an object in the typical way we think of objects. And it's not the object of desire, but the object cause of desire. It's the basis for why we desire other particular concrete objects. And despite going unrecognized, the barred subject does form a highly particular relationship with this object. And this is where we arrive at the formula for fundamental fantasy. which represents a way of thinking of the subject-object relation. On one side is the barred subject, who is under threat of vanishing because it approaches a dimension of itself that lacks symbolic supports. On the other side is object A, the unnameable cause of desire, motivating and directing the subject in its capacity to desire while itself remaining opaque to the subject. And then there's this middle term, the relation between subject and object, that is perhaps identified as the unconscious itself, or perhaps the particular unconscious manner of relating to objects. In the next video, we'll wrap up Seminar 6, considering how that manner of relating expresses itself in terms of the clinical structures, as well as the kind of relationship with the object that's entailed in sublimation. Thank you for watching to the end. If you got something out of this video and want to support this work, there are several ways you can do that. You can like this video, share it, subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already, and there are other financial ways you can support this work through the Super Thanks button here on YouTube, as well as become a Patreon supporter where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. I'd like to thank the following for already supporting this work over on Patreon. So we're reaching the end of this seminar, and you can really see the preliminary thinking that's going on that will lead into Seminar 7, the ethics of psychoanalysis. I hope if you do celebrate the holiday seasons that you're able to come to a place of symbolically accepting the disappointment that it brings so that you can enter into the holiday season more fully. So I'll see you next time. Be well.